The border between India and Pakistan is on high alert. Both nuclear powers have deployed their armed forces, the airspace is closed, diplomatic relations are frozen, and there are nightly exchanges of fire along the line of control. The world is currently holding its breath because a single spark could ignite a wildfire. This latest escalation was triggered by a brutal terrorist attack on April 22nd in Pahalgam, India. 26 people, mostly Hindu tourists, were murdered by armed men. The attackers apparently specifically asked their victims about their religion before opening fire, which further exacerbates the already religiously charged conflict between India and Pakistan. Because the Pakistani government itself is held responsible for these extremist groups. Pakistan, on the other hand, denies any blame and speaks of a possible false flag operation. But since then, events have been unfolding rapidly. India has suspended the Indus Water Treaty, expelled Pakistani diplomats, and closed the airspace to all Pakistani aircraft. Pakistan responded with similar measures and has now even suspended the peace agreement. Both countries have reinforced their troops along the border in recent days, and there are already regular exchanges of fire. The Pakistani defense minister even warns that an Indian invasion could be imminent in a few hours, so the situation is quite serious. But how could a single attack bring the region to the brink of a major war? Why have India and Pakistan been so hostile for decades, and is there now a real threat of war between two nuclear powers? We'll look at all these exciting questions in today's video. Let us first look at the origins of the conflict, which began in 1947 when British colonial rule over the Indian subcontinent ended. The partition led to the creation of two independent states, Hindu-majority India and Muslim Pakistan. This division was accompanied by massive population displacement and violence, in which an estimated 1 million people lost their lives. The Principality of Jammu and Kashmir played a special role in this. With a majority Muslim population but a Hindu ruler, it was faced with the decision of joining either India or Pakistan. However, the Hindu Maharaja hesitated to make a decision. Only when Pashtun tribal fighters from Pakistan invaded the area did the Maharaja ask India for military assistance and also sign the accession agreement. However, this became the first Indian-Pakistani war between 1947 and 1949, which ended with a ceasefire brokered by the UN. The region was divided along the so-called line of control, with India controlling about 2/3 and Pakistan 1/3 of the area. But this was only the beginning of a series of further wars between the two states. This was followed by the Second Indo-Pakistani War in 1965, another attempt by Pakistan to bring Kashmir under its control. This again ended with a ceasefire mediated by the Soviet Union and the USA. But a short time later, in 1971, the Third Indo-Pakistani War broke out. This ultimately led to the independence of Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan. Although the conflict was not directly linked to the Kashmir conflict, it increased the mistrust between the two nations. And then we have the 1999 Kargil War. At that time, Pakistani soldiers and fighters infiltrated Indian territory in the Kargil region. India then launched a military offensive to push back the invaders. Here too, the conflict ended with a withdrawal of Pakistani forces after international pressure, particularly from the USA, was exerted on Pakistan. Nevertheless, both states have been in a hostile state for almost decades and feel threatened by each other, although the conflict has continued rather indirectly for a long time. Mutual cyber and hacker attacks on critical infrastructure occurred almost weekly. But there are also numerous dangers and threats lurking online, and it is essential to take precautions. This led to both countries eventually developing nuclear weapons in the 1990s. India pursues a no first use doctrine, while Pakistan reserves the right to launch a first strike, especially if it feels threatened to its existence. This nuclear buildup has significantly increased the risks of escalation, as even conventional conflicts now have the potential to escalate into nuclear war. On the other hand, however, this also leads to a short-term relaxation, in which reality none of the states had any interest in a nuclear exchange. It was only in 2019 that the situation became significantly more tense again. At that time, the Indian government revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, which led to massive protests. Pakistan strongly condemned this move and considered it a violation of international agreements. And since then, incidents have repeatedly occurred along the line of control, including exchanges of fire, terrorist attacks, and mutual accusations. The region remains a constant powder keg that could explode at any moment, and one of these sparks occurred a few weeks ago. On April 22nd, a brutal terrorist attack rocked Pahalgam region in the Indian part of Kashmir. 5 gunmen opened fire on a group of tourists, killing 26 people, including 25 Indian tourists and 1 Nepalese national. The attackers are said to have specifically asked their victims about their religion before opening fire, which is of course highly controversial in this highly charged conflict between India and Pakistan, and caused a big stir in the media, especially since the Pakistani government is said to have close ties to Islamist groups. The Resistance Front group, which is considered an offshoot of the Pakistani organization Lashkar-e-Taiba, initially claimed responsibility for the attack. However, they later retracted this statement. For India, however, it is clear that the Pakistani government must support this. For years, they have accused Pakistan of supporting these and other groups and using them as proxies in the Kashmir conflict. Pakistan, however, rejects these allegations and calls for an independent investigation into the incident. But the spiral of escalation was already in full swing. As early as April 24th, the Indian government ordered the departure of all Pakistani nationals. In addition, all Pakistani diplomats should leave the country immediately. At the same time, India suspended the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty, which regulates water distribution between the two countries. This measure was described by Pakistan as an act of declaration of war, as the Indus is the country's lifeline. India also closed its airspace to all Pakistani aircraft, including military ones, until May 23rd. The Indian Army also intensified its operations in Kashmir, arresting numerous suspects and destroying the homes of suspected terrorists. And there were exchanges of fire between Indian and Pakistani troops along the line of control. Indian Prime Minister Modi gave the army full operational freedom to operate in Kashmir. Pakistan, on the other hand, also reacted immediately to the action and expelled all Indian diplomats and closed its airspace to Indian aircraft. In addition, visas for Indian nationals were suspended. At the same time, it also suspended the 1972 Simla Agreement, which provides for the peaceful settlement of the conflict. And Pakistan's information minister stated that credible intelligence indicates an imminent Indian attack in the next 24 to 36 hours. It will also respond decisively to any aggression. Now, this deadline has already expired. Nevertheless, there is not much evidence of any easing so far. Fearing possible attacks, Pakistan closed religious seminaries for 10 days and evacuated tourists from the border areas. And Modi even cancelled his participation in the 9th May Day celebrations in Russia, where he was supposed to meet Putin. At present, no one can predict exactly how the conflict will develop. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio held talks with the foreign ministers of India and Pakistan to encourage both sides to exercise restraint. But the US is said to have a clear proximity to India, and this brings us to geopolitics, because in some parts it can even be perceived as a proxy war. China openly supports Pakistan and also has self-interests and claims in the region. On the other hand, the EU and the US traditionally maintain a closer relationship with India, which is seen as an increasingly important counterweight to China. But things get even more complicated because Russia is also against China in this conflict, and clearly behind India, with which it has maintained very close economic and military relations since the Cold War. On the other hand, the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia traditionally support close allies of the West, in this case Pakistan, and have close economic relations there. And then there is Turkey, which is considered Pakistan's closest ally. Both countries have massively expanded their defense cooperation, including joint military exercises and armament projects. In February 2025, both countries signed 24 agreements to deepen their economic cooperation. Between 2020 and 2024, about 10% of all Turkish arms exports went to Pakistan, and in recent days there have been numerous reports that further military equipment has been delivered. The conflict is therefore of enormous importance, not only regionally but also globally, especially since there are two nuclear powers that are directly confronting each other. What will happen next is, of course, very difficult to predict. However, it is considered quite certain that India will react, if only to save face in front of its own population. However, the same will also apply to the Pakistani government after a possible Indian attack. And so the question is to what extent both states will react, because a lot will depend on military and diplomatic tact as to whether the spiral of escalation can be reversed and both states will emerge from the conflict with their faces spared, because both countries actually have very little interest in a larger and long-term conflict. But what do you think? How will this conflict develop in the next few days? Feel free to write it in the comments. Well, folks, and with that, we end our video today. Write us your thoughts on this in the comments and let us know about which topics we should make a video about. Otherwise, subscribe to our channel and see you next time here at Wikipedia Plus. Thank you all for watching to the end. I hope you enjoyed our content. A big hug, and until then, bye.